In the first 10 minutes, Robert McCall kills a room full of men without breaking a sweat. By the end of The Equalizer 3, he can barely walk. And that contrast is the entire movie hiding in plain sight. Because if you remember the first Equalizer, the violence was the point. McCall entered a room, studied the geometry, calculated the variables, and transformed ordinary objects into instruments of punishment. A bottle, a corkscrew, a piece of glass, a nail, a knife. Nothing was simply sitting there. Everything had a purpose, and McCall understood that purpose faster than anyone else in the room. In 2014, that was intoxicating. It gave us the fantasy of watching a seemingly ordinary man reveal that beneath the quiet exterior was an almost impossibly efficient machine. But The Equalizer 3 opens by showing us something different. The machine is still there. The instincts are still there. The precision is still there. What has changed is the body carrying them. And more importantly, the soul. The sequence begins in a place that looks almost deliberately unremarkable, a secluded Italian estate, a quiet environment that should feel peaceful, warm, even inviting. Instead, McCall moves through it like an intruder from another genre. There is no grand orchestral announcement telling you that the legendary Robert McCall has arrived. There is no heroic entrance. There is simply Denzel Washington walking through the space with that familiar, almost unnerving calm. He doesn't need to tell you what he's thinking because the character has always communicated through observation. He looks. He listens. He measures. And then the violence begins. What makes this opening so effective isn't simply that McCall is good at killing people. We already know that. The unsettling part is how little effort it seems to require. He doesn't fight like someone desperately trying to survive. He fights like someone completing a task. That distinction is crucial. In most action movies, violence is presented as an eruption. A character gets angry, someone pulls a gun, bodies collide, furniture breaks, and the scene becomes increasingly chaotic. McCall works in the opposite direction. His violence is subtraction. He removes possibilities. He takes a room full of threats and reduces them one decision at a time. A gun becomes useless because he has already anticipated where it will be pointed. A man becomes vulnerable because McCall has already noticed where he is standing. A weapon becomes something that can be turned against its owner. Even time itself seems to bend around him. The famous countdown associated with his method isn't merely a cool gimmick. It gives the violence a strange mathematical quality. McCall doesn't seem to be asking whether he can win. He's determining how long winning will take. And that's where the fantasy begins. Because you aren't just watching a man beat up criminals. You're watching uncertainty disappear. In the world of The Equalizer, McCall enters situations where everyone else sees chaos, but he sees structure. He sees the hidden pattern underneath the noise. You can feel the satisfaction of it because the movie invites you to share his perspective. You notice the objects. You notice the exits. You notice the distance between people. Suddenly, a table isn't a table anymore. It's leverage. A bottle isn't a bottle. It's a weapon. A hallway isn't a hallway. It's a funnel. The environment becomes a diagram, and McCall is the only person who knows how to read it. That is the McCall method. It isn't simply fighting. It is preparation, observation, timing, and absolute commitment. But in The Equalizer 3, the method has begun to feel less like a superpower and more like a disease. Watch Denzel Washington closely during this opening. The performance isn't built around rage. It isn't even built around excitement. His face remains almost completely controlled. Yet there is something different underneath that control. The old McCall enjoyed the clarity that violence provided. This McCall seems exhausted by it. And that tiny difference changes everything. The movie understands that the most interesting thing you can do with an invincible action hero isn't make him stronger. It's make him tired. That sounds simple, but it completely changes the emotional mathematics of the character. If McCall can kill almost anyone, then the question can't remain, can he win? We've already answered that. The more interesting question becomes, what does winning cost him now? And the opening gives us the first answer before the film even settles into its story. His body. His isolation. His ability to imagine a life beyond violence. The final image of this sequence is not really a victory. It is a warning. McCall has survived another confrontation, but something has gone wrong. He has been shot. He has been wounded. And when Denzel finally allows the physical pain to register, the mythology cracks. Suddenly, the man who seemed capable of controlling everything is sitting in the aftermath of his own decisions. The legend has a pulse. The legend bleeds. The legend can fall. That matters because the Equalizer franchise has always depended on a contradiction. McCall wants to be a good man, but his solution to evil is often extraordinarily violent. He wants to protect people, but he can only seem to do it by becoming the most dangerous person in the room. He wants redemption, yet his path toward redemption repeatedly leads through bodies. In the first movie, that contradiction feels like the engine of a revenge fantasy. In the second, it becomes more personal. But by the third, it becomes existential. McCall isn't simply asking whether the people around him deserve justice. He's asking whether he deserves a life. And that is why the opening feels colder than the action sequences that follow. The blood is not shocking because we've seen McCall do this before. What is shocking is the realization that this time, the violence doesn't make him feel larger. It makes him feel smaller. More mortal. More alone. More aware that every time he reaches for the weapon, he is reinforcing the identity he has spent years trying to escape. This is where the Equalizer 3 quietly announces that it is not interested in becoming another escalation machine. It could have gone bigger. More enemies, more explosions, more elaborate set pieces, more impossible odds. Instead, Antoine Fuqua does something much more interesting. He slows down. He takes the character out of the concrete, industrial darkness of Boston and places him under the Mediterranean sun. He surrounds him with old streets, cafes, church bells, balconies, vegetables, bicycles, elderly neighbors, children, and people who know each other's names. And suddenly McCall's greatest problem is no longer how to survive a violent world. It is how to exist inside a peaceful one. That is a much harder problem for him. Because a man built around violence doesn't necessarily know what to do when nobody is asking him to fight. We often talk about action heroes as though their greatest achievement is physical dominance. But McCall's greatest achievement, if the trilogy is ultimately about redemption, has to be something else. It has to be restraint. The ability to see an injustice and not immediately become its executioner. The ability to put down the weapon without feeling that he has abandoned his purpose. The ability to understand that saving people doesn't always mean destroying the people who hurt them. The Equalizer 3 isn't there yet. Not at the beginning. At the beginning, McCall is still the knife. He just hasn't realized how badly he wants to stop being one. And that brings us to the larger question. Why does this specific brand of violence feel so satisfying? It's because it isn't just chaos, it's architecture. The pleasure comes from watching a world that initially looks unpredictable become completely legible through the eyes of one extraordinarily patient man. That's what the first Equalizer understood so well. It turned violence into choreography, but more importantly, it turned observation into power. Before McCall ever throws a punch, he has already won the intellectual battle. He knows where everyone is. He knows what everyone wants. He knows what they will do next. And for a viewer, that creates an almost hypnotic sense of control. You aren't waiting to see whether McCall survives. You're waiting to see how he has already solved the problem. That is the tactical fantasy at the center of the character, and to understand why the Equalizer 3 feels so different, we have to go back to where that fantasy came from. In 2014, Robert McCall arrived at a very specific moment in action cinema. The genre had spent years becoming louder, faster, and more physically extreme. Characters were increasingly defined by what they could survive. Broken bones became temporary inconveniences. Gunshots became punctuation marks. Heroes could fall from buildings, crash through windows, get hit by cars, and still stand up because the spectacle demanded it. Then the Equalizer came along and offered a different kind of power. McCall wasn't young. He wasn't presented as a muscular superhero. He didn't swagger into danger looking for a fight. He looked like a middle-aged man who wanted to be left alone. And that made the reveal more satisfying. The fantasy wasn't simply that he was strong. It was that everyone underestimated him. That idea is older than cinema itself, but the Equalizer gave it a particularly modern shape. McCall was the ghost in the room. The person nobody noticed until it was too late. And Denzel Washington was perhaps the perfect actor for that role because his screen presence had already taught audiences to read silence as authority. Washington didn't need to play McCall as an eccentric genius or a snarling action monster. He could simply sit there and let the room change around him. That restraint became part of the fantasy. The character doesn't chase attention because he doesn't need validation. He knows exactly what he is capable of. You, as the viewer, are the one who gets the privilege of discovering it. This is where the tactical fantasy becomes more interesting than the generic phrase badass action hero. A badass character can win because the script says they're tough. McCall wins because the movie spends time showing you how he thinks. The violence has a logic. There is a before, during, and after. Before the fight, he observes. During the fight, he improvises. After the fight, he restores order. That rhythm creates the feeling that McCall isn't merely reacting to danger. He's conducting it. The first film especially turns this into a kind of ritual. McCall sits in a diner. He reads. He watches people. He measures time. His routines are repetitive, almost obsessive. At first, those routines make him seem harmless. Then you realize they are the routines of someone who has spent decades training himself to remain prepared. And that's the key to his mythology. He doesn't look powerful because he is always displaying power. He looks powerful because he doesn't need to. The weapon remains invisible until the exact moment it becomes necessary. This separates McCall from the more conventional action archetype of the era. Think about the difference between a character who enters a room carrying an arsenal and McCall entering empty-handed. The former tells you what he is capable of. The latter makes you curious. And curiosity is one of the most effective engines an action movie can have. Every object becomes suspicious. Every glance becomes meaningful. Every quiet moment feels like the movie is hiding information from you. When McCall finally acts, the payoff is not simply physical. It is intellectual. You realize he has been several moves ahead. This is why his fights often feel almost like puzzle solutions. The violence is brutal, sometimes horrifyingly so, but it is presented through the lens of control. That control is what makes it feel satisfying. And yet, there is a danger in building an action hero around absolute competence. If the character can always solve the problem, tension begins to disappear. If he can read every room perfectly, then uncertainty becomes difficult to maintain. If every villain exists mainly to demonstrate how much smarter and faster he is, then eventually the hero stops feeling human. He becomes a mechanism. The franchise partially embraced that fantasy. The second film expanded the scale while maintaining the same basic appeal. McCall became almost mythological. He could move through violence with a level of efficiency that bordered on supernatural. And audiences loved it because, let's be honest, there is something deeply comforting about the fantasy of competence. You live in a world where problems are messy. Institutions fail. Bad people sometimes win. Justice is slow. Consequences are uneven. Then along comes a character who sees a problem and solves it completely. No paperwork. No committee. No endless debate. Just observation, decision, action. The fantasy is not necessarily about violence. Violence is simply the language the fantasy uses. The deeper fantasy is control. McCall can restore order because he is willing to do what everyone else is unwilling or unable to do. That's why the character resonated so strongly in the 2010s. He belonged to the same cultural ecosystem as other hyper-competent protagonists, but he was slower, older, quieter, and more introspective. He wasn't trying to become a legend. He was trying to escape one. That contradiction gave the series its emotional potential. The problem was that the action genre itself was becoming increasingly addicted to escalation. The more successful characters became, the more spectacular their next challenge had to be. One film becomes a gang. The next becomes a conspiracy. Then the world expands, the explosions grow larger, the body count rises, and the hero's humanity risks getting buried beneath the mechanics of the franchise. The Equalizer 3 could have followed exactly that path. Instead, it almost deliberately reverses it. And that's where the movie's most important shift begins. Rather than asking how far McCall can push his abilities, Fuqua asks what happens when those abilities are no longer enough to define him. The character has aged. Denzel Washington has aged. The audience has aged. The genre has aged. And suddenly, the fantasy of the perfect killer feels different when the killer's body is visibly approaching its limits. This is not the same McCall who walked through Boston streets with the certainty of a man who had already accepted every possible consequence. This McCall is beginning to understand that consequences don't disappear simply because you are good at surviving them. They accumulate. Every life he has taken exists somewhere in the architecture of his conscience. Every time he intervenes, he creates another reason for violence to follow him. Every person he saves becomes another reminder of the kind of man he wants to be, while every body he leaves behind becomes evidence of the man he actually is. That is the tension The Equalizer 3 finally brings to the surface. And the most fascinating way it does that is by changing the geography. Boston gave McCall concrete. Italy gives him sunlight. Boston gave him anonymity. Italy gives him community. Boston allowed him to disappear into crowds. Italy gives him people who look him in the eye and remember his name. The setting is not merely beautiful. It is confrontational. It challenges the mythology of Robert McCall simply by refusing to behave like the world he is used to. Why is The Equalizer 3 the only action movie in recent memory that feels like an Italian neorealist painting? Part of the answer is that the film isn't always trying to make the landscape look impressive. It is trying to make the landscape feel lived in. The narrow streets, weathered buildings, small shops, church bells, outdoor tables, and warm sunlight aren't just decorative elements behind the action. They create a different moral atmosphere. In the previous films, McCall's environments often felt like places where violence could hide. Here, violence becomes an intrusion. And that distinction changes the way you perceive him. When McCall walks through a dark warehouse, you expect him to become dangerous. When he walks through a sunlit Italian street, you begin to wonder whether he can become ordinary. That is a much more difficult transformation. Moving the story to Italy wasn't just a production choice, it was a thematic necessity to force McCall out of the shadows and into the sun. Because the moment McCall arrives in Altamont, the film stops being primarily about a man hunting criminals and starts becoming about a man being offered a second life. Not a perfect life. Not an innocent life. McCall is far too damaged for that. But perhaps a quiet one. And quiet is something he has never really known how to accept. Altamont feels almost impossibly peaceful at first, but that peace is precisely what makes it narratively useful. It is a place where people sit together. They eat together. They argue. They gossip. They greet one another in the street. The rhythms are slow because the movie wants you to notice something McCall has spent decades ignoring: ordinary life has its own form of heroism. There is courage in opening a shop every morning. There is courage in caring for an elderly neighbor. There is courage in raising a child, repairing a building, making coffee, checking on someone who lives alone. None of these acts produce a body count. None of them make you look invincible. But they create the kind of stability McCall has spent his life destroying and defending in equal measure. That is why Altamont cannot simply be a pretty backdrop. It has to become a character. And the more McCall observes it, the more the movie quietly asks him a question he has avoided for years: what if you could belong somewhere? What if you didn't have to be the ghost anymore? What if the life you thought you had to sacrifice in order to protect other people could actually be part of the protection itself? McCall doesn't know how to answer that yet. He is still carrying the old mythology with him. The knife is still in his hand. The body is still moving. The instincts are still intact. But the world around him is beginning to suggest that perhaps the greatest act of violence he can commit against his old identity is simply to stop feeding it. And that is where The Equalizer 3 becomes something more than a final action sequel. It becomes a story about a man standing at the edge of his own legend, looking back at everything it cost him, and wondering whether there is anything left on the other side. Altamont is beautiful, but The Equalizer 3 is careful not to make beauty feel meaningless. The town works because it represents everything Robert McCall has spent his life moving away from. He has lived in shadows, hotels, trains, apartments, safe houses, and anonymous streets. His existence has been defined by movement. He arrives, observes, intervenes, disappears. That pattern makes him effective, but it also makes him homeless in the deepest possible sense. He has places where he sleeps, but nowhere that truly belongs to him. Altamont changes that equation. Here, people recognize one another. They know who owns which shop. They notice when somebody is missing from the cafe. They remember small details. The town operates through memory, and memory is dangerous for a man like McCall because it makes disappearing harder. This is why the Italian setting feels almost like an intervention. McCall doesn't simply enter Altamont. He gets absorbed into it. He receives care from people who don't know his history. He becomes a familiar face before they understand what he is capable of. And that creates one of the movie's most interesting tensions. The people of this town don't see the legend. They see a wounded stranger. They see a quiet man who likes coffee, watches the streets, and occasionally helps someone who needs it. Their perception is incomplete, but emotionally, it is exactly what McCall needs. They give him the opportunity to exist without his past being the first thing anyone sees. And then the Camorra arrives. The contrast is almost too perfect. Altamont represents community. The criminals represent extraction. They don't simply want money. They want control over the conditions of everyday life. They intimidate businesses, manipulate people, and turn ordinary spaces into places of fear. The movie understands that this kind of evil is more disturbing when it doesn't look extraordinary. These aren't supernatural monsters. They aren't theatrical comic book villains delivering speeches about world domination. They are men who understand that fear can be monetized. Their power comes from making ordinary people feel helpless. That is why McCall's response feels different this time. In the earlier films, he often encounters individuals who trigger his protective instincts. Here, he encounters an entire community that reminds him of the people he has spent his life trying to protect. The scale is smaller, but emotionally, it is larger. He isn't simply saving one person. He is deciding whether he can become part of a place. The character who most clearly represents that possibility is Gio, the local police officer who gradually becomes aware that McCall is not an ordinary stranger. Their relationship is built less on exposition than recognition. Gio understands that something is unusual about this man, but he doesn't immediately demand an explanation. There is a kind of mutual respect between them. One man operates within the law. The other operates outside it. Yet both understand that the town needs protection. This is important because The Equalizer 3 doesn't present McCall as the only possible solution. Geo represents legitimate community responsibility. McCall represents the darker, more violent tradition of protection. The tension between them quietly raises the question of whether McCall can finally support someone else's attempt to create justice instead of always becoming justice himself. Then there is Enzo, the doctor who treats McCall after the opening attack. Enzo's role is deceptively important because he introduces something McCall rarely receives: care without conditions. McCall arrives wounded, and instead of asking what happened or who he killed, Enzo simply treats him. He sees the injury before he sees the mythology. In a franchise built around a man who fixes other people's problems, that reversal matters. For once, someone is fixing him. And Denzel Washington makes that vulnerability surprisingly powerful because he refuses to overplay it. McCall doesn't suddenly become helpless. He remains McCall. His eyes still scan the room. His instincts remain active. But his body is no longer cooperating perfectly with his identity. He has been shot, and the wound isn't just another obstacle to overcome. It is the movie's way of introducing mortality into the mythology. That opening gunshot is one of the most important decisions in the entire film. The Equalizer has always depended on the idea that McCall can calculate his way out of almost anything. He may be outnumbered, but he is rarely overwhelmed. Yet here, the film begins by damaging him before he even understands what his next chapter will be. The wound lingers. The limp lingers. The physical weakness lingers. This is where the title character becomes vulnerable in a way the earlier films rarely allowed. Not emotionally vulnerable in the conventional sense. McCall has always carried guilt and trauma. The new vulnerability is physical. His body has finally started keeping score. And if you have watched enough action movies, you know exactly how unusual that is. Aging heroes are often allowed to look old until the moment the action begins. Then the movie quietly forgets their age. They sprint, jump, punch, shoot, and survive with the same physical certainty they had decades earlier. The Equalizer 3 does something more honest. It lets Denzel Washington look his age. It allows the physicality to become part of the storytelling rather than an inconvenience the camera has to hide. That doesn't make McCall weak. It makes every action heavier. When he walks, you notice the pace. When he sits, you notice the effort. When he stands after an injury, there is a sense that the movement costs something. And because the movie spends time with him outside the action, you actually have time to register those details. In a faster film, the wound might disappear between set pieces. Here, the injury becomes part of the atmosphere. The most interesting thing is that McCall himself doesn't seem particularly interested in preserving the myth. He isn't desperately trying to prove that he is still the toughest man alive. There is no insecurity driving him to show off. If anything, there is relief in the possibility that he might finally be allowed to stop. That makes the film's violence strangely melancholy. When McCall eventually decides to confront the Camorra, you understand why he does it. But you also understand that every act of violence pulls him back toward an identity he is trying to leave behind. He is good at this. Almost frighteningly good. The problem is that being good at killing people has never given him a life. This is where the film's Western influence becomes impossible to ignore. McCall is an aging gunfighter who has wandered into a town controlled by men who believe they own it. The townspeople are afraid. The authorities are compromised or overwhelmed. The stranger arrives with a violent history and slowly decides that he cannot simply walk away. But unlike the classic Western hero, McCall isn't seeking one final showdown to prove his legend. He is seeking permission to stop being a legend. That difference is the heart of the movie. In a traditional Western, the gunslinger rides into town, defeats the villain, and rides away because he understands that civilization cannot contain someone like him. McCall's story moves in the opposite direction. He wants to stay. He wants to become part of the town. He wants to drink coffee without scanning every doorway. He wants to know people without calculating whether they are targets or threats. The irony is that he may have to become the most violent version of himself one last time to earn that possibility. And that contradiction gives The Equalizer 3 its unusual emotional texture. The film isn't pretending violence is good. It is asking whether violence can ever be the final step toward peace for someone whose entire identity has been built around it. That is a much sadder question. Because McCall isn't discovering that he enjoys killing. He already knows what violence feels like. He knows how efficient he can be. He knows what happens when he decides somebody deserves punishment. What he is discovering is that competence does not equal purpose. You can be extraordinarily good at something and still realize that you don't want to spend the rest of your life doing it. That idea becomes especially powerful when we consider Denzel Washington himself. Washington was in his late 70s when The Equalizer 3 was made. He wasn't playing a younger action hero through digital tricks and aggressive editing. The film's entire identity depends on acknowledging his age. His physical presence has changed, and the character's relationship with violence has to change with it. This is where Antoine Fuqua's direction becomes essential. Fuqua could have hidden Washington's age behind rapid cuts, constant music, and spectacle. Instead, he often does the opposite. He lets the camera sit with him. He lets moments breathe. He gives Washington room to communicate through posture, stillness, and expression. The result is a kind of existential acting. McCall doesn't need to explain every thought because Washington can communicate exhaustion with a glance. He can make a pause feel like a decision. He can sit at a cafe table and make you wonder whether the character is watching the people around him or imagining what it would feel like to belong among them. That shorthand between actor and director has been developing across their collaborations for years. The Equalizer films are obviously central, but their working relationship extends beyond this trilogy. They understand how much information Washington can communicate without dialogue, and The Equalizer 3 relies on that understanding more heavily than either previous installment. The movie's quieter scenes are therefore not empty spaces between action sequences. They are where the character is actually changing. This is especially apparent in the way McCall watches ordinary people. He isn't simply gathering intelligence anymore. He is observing a lifestyle he never allowed himself to have. Children walk through the streets. Friends sit together. Shopkeepers complain about business. People drink coffee in the sunlight. Life happens without requiring anyone to save it. For McCall, that may be the most alien spectacle in the movie. He understands violence intuitively. Peace is harder. And that is why Altamont becomes more than a setting. It becomes a test. The town doesn't ask McCall to become innocent. Nobody could reasonably ask that of him. Instead, it gives him the chance to become useful without becoming destructive. That distinction matters. McCall has spent years believing that his value comes from what he can do to bad people. Altamont suggests that his value might come from what he can do for good people. The first identity is built around punishment. The second is built around presence. And presence is exactly what McCall has lacked. He has always been passing through. Now, for perhaps the first time, the movie asks him to stay. The question is whether a man who has spent his entire life running from his own darkness can finally stand in the light without reaching for a weapon. We've seen Denzel play the hero before, but here, he's playing something harder, a man who is tired of being one. That distinction sounds subtle until you watch how much The Equalizer 3 communicates without saying. Robert McCall has never been a particularly talkative protagonist. His silence has always been part of his appeal. But silence can mean many things. In the first Equalizer, McCall's silence feels like control. He is withholding information because he knows more than everyone around him. In the third film, that same silence often feels like reflection. He isn't hiding what he knows. He is considering what it has made him. That evolution is one of the clearest examples of what Antoine Fuqua and Denzel Washington have developed together across their collaborations. Their partnership works because Fuqua understands that Washington doesn't need to perform intensity in the conventional way. Give him a room, give him a reason to look at someone, and allow the camera to stay there, and the audience starts doing the work. We begin interpreting the smallest changes in his expression. A glance lasts slightly longer. A smile disappears. His posture changes. His voice becomes quieter. Suddenly, a scene that contains almost no dialogue has told us something important. That is existential acting. It isn't about announcing an internal crisis. It is about allowing the crisis to exist underneath ordinary behavior. McCall is still buying coffee. He is still walking through town. He is still helping people. But underneath those ordinary actions is the realization that his old life has become increasingly difficult to carry. Washington plays that realization without turning McCall into a sentimental character. He doesn't become openly emotional. He doesn't suddenly confess everything he regrets. The restraint is what makes the performance believable. Fuqua's camera respects that restraint. The director could have treated McCall's age as a limitation, but instead, he makes age part of the visual language. The pacing becomes more deliberate. The film frequently allows Washington's physical presence to occupy the frame without immediately cutting away. You see him sit. You see him walk. You see him think. These moments would be almost invisible in a conventional action movie, where every second has to generate momentum. Here, they become the momentum. And that is a major evolution from the first film. 2014's The Equalizer was built around anticipation. The camera often encouraged you to look at the environment the way McCall did. What can he use? Where can he move? How quickly can he eliminate the threat? The suspense came from watching the plan assemble itself. The Equalizer 3 is more interested in what happens after the plan. What happens when the room is empty? What happens when the bodies are gone? What does McCall do when nobody needs to be rescued? Those questions are harder to answer than the tactical ones. Denzel Washington understands that because he has spent decades playing characters whose authority comes from internal control. His screen persona often carries a fascinating contradiction. He can dominate a scene without appearing desperate to dominate it. That quality makes McCall feel less like a superhero and more like a man who has already survived the part of his life where proving himself mattered. That is why the character's age becomes an advantage dramatically. He isn't trying to become stronger. He is trying to become quieter. And Fuqua gives him a world where quietness can actually matter. The director's decision to embrace the Italian setting also creates a visual contrast with their earlier work together. In darker environments, McCall can disappear into architecture. Concrete, shadows, rain, night streets, warehouses, stairwells. Those spaces naturally support the mythology of the ghost. He can move through them almost invisibly. Altamont doesn't allow that. Sunlight exposes him. Warm colors surround him. People see him. That visual exposure mirrors the emotional exposure taking place inside the character. McCall is no longer simply hiding from the world. He is beginning to let the world see him. But there is another reason the Fuqua-Washington partnership works so well here. Both filmmaker and actor understand restraint. Action cinema often assumes that intensity comes from acceleration. Faster cuts. Louder sound. More enemies. Bigger explosions. Fuqua occasionally gives us that kind of spectacle, but The Equalizer 3 is strongest when he refuses to chase it. The camera can remain still while Washington barely moves, because the audience already knows what this man is capable of. That knowledge becomes part of the tension. When McCall enters a room, we don't need the film to tell us he is dangerous. We've already seen the evidence. The suspense comes from whether he will choose to become dangerous. That is a much more mature form of tension. It also allows the film to separate McCall's ability from his identity. He can still kill. He can still calculate. He can still dismantle a group of armed men with terrifying efficiency. But none of those abilities automatically determine what he should do. And that is the question the movie keeps returning to. Should he? Not can he. Should he? For a character like McCall, that is almost revolutionary. The earlier films frequently frame his violence as a moral response. Someone is being exploited, abused, threatened, or murdered, and McCall intervenes. The logic is understandable. But The Equalizer 3 is more interested in the psychological cost of constantly occupying that position. What happens when you become the person everyone expects to solve the problem through violence? What happens when violence becomes your language of care? McCall's tragedy is that he has become extremely fluent in that language. He knows how to protect people by destroying threats. He doesn't know how to protect himself from becoming defined by destruction. That is where the film's villains become important. The Camorra aren't designed to compete with McCall as larger-than-life action icons. They are intentionally ordinary. Their cruelty isn't theatrical. They don't need elaborate speeches explaining their philosophy. They represent something much more mundane, organized exploitation. And that makes them an interesting opponent for McCall. The Camorra are essentially bureaucracy with guns. They use intimidation like paperwork. They collect money. They enforce territory. They control businesses. They make people understand that resistance will be punished. There is nothing glamorous about them, and that is precisely the point. The Equalizer has always been about correcting power imbalances. McCall sees somebody vulnerable, identifies the person exploiting them, and intervenes. But in Altamont, the problem is systemic enough that there isn't one dramatic monster responsible for everything. There is a network of people who benefit from fear. That makes McCall's job both easier and harder. Easier because he knows exactly what to do with violent men. Harder because eliminating individuals doesn't necessarily eliminate the conditions that created them. The film doesn't explore this with the complexity of a political thriller, and it doesn't need to. Its villains function symbolically. They represent the mundane persistence of evil. Evil doesn't always arrive as a genius mastermind. Sometimes it arrives as a man collecting protection money from a restaurant owner. Sometimes it arrives as somebody intimidating a shopkeeper. Sometimes it is simply the knowledge that the people with power can hurt you whenever they want. That kind of evil is especially compatible with McCall's mythology because he exists as a counterforce to it. If the villains turn fear into a system, McCall turns fear back against them. But there is an important difference this time. McCall isn't motivated by revenge. He is motivated by belonging. That distinction makes his eventual confrontation feel less like a mission and more like a choice. He has finally found a place that gives him something he never thought he could have, and now that place is threatened. He could walk away. He has done it before. He could tell himself that these aren't his problems. He could disappear and allow the local authorities to handle it. But that would mean accepting the limitations of the peaceful life he wants. So McCall has to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes choosing peace means defending the conditions that make peace possible. The question is whether he can do that without becoming addicted to the old identity again. That tension gives the final action sequences their emotional weight. We aren't simply watching McCall fight because the movie needs a fight. We are watching a man return to the one language he knows while hoping it won't become his entire vocabulary again. And Denzel plays that conflict through tiny choices. He doesn't look excited. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks determined. There is a difference. Triumph belongs to the fantasy of the invincible hero. Determination belongs to the aging man who knows exactly what violence will cost him and chooses it anyway. That is why the physicality matters so much. McCall isn't moving like someone who believes he has unlimited time. Every confrontation carries a sense of finality. The body is no longer an invisible machine supporting the myth. It is part of the story. The franchise began by asking us to admire what McCall could do. The third film asks us to understand why he does it. Those are not the same question. And the deeper Fuqua gets into that distinction, the more the movie begins to resemble a Western rather than a conventional modern action franchise. The Western hero is often defined by a contradiction. He is capable of violence, perhaps more capable than anyone else around him, but he understands that the world he wants cannot be built entirely through violence. McCall is living inside that contradiction. He is the man who can save a town because he knows how to kill the people controlling it. But he can only truly save himself if he learns that killing isn't the only thing he has to offer. That is the quiet revolution of The Equalizer 3. It doesn't destroy the tactical fantasy. It simply ages it. The fantasy remains satisfying. The fights still work. McCall is still terrifying. The objects still become weapons. The choreography still gives us that familiar pleasure of watching an impossible problem become solvable. But now there is sadness underneath the satisfaction. Every time McCall demonstrates how good he is, we are also reminded of how long he has been doing this. Every perfect move carries history. Every body carries memory. Every victory brings him closer to the question he has been avoiding. What happens when the perfect weapon finally decides it wants to become a man again? And that is why the villains of The Equalizer 3 don't need to be larger than life. They don't need to outsmart McCall. They don't even need to come close to matching him physically. Their purpose is simpler. They give him one final reason to pick up the knife. The tragedy is that he is already tired of holding it. If the first film made violence feel like liberation, the third makes it feel like inheritance. McCall has inherited a capacity for destruction that once gave his life purpose. Now he has to decide whether that inheritance controls him or whether he can finally put it down. That is where the movie's central idea becomes impossible to ignore. The most important battle isn't between McCall and the Camorra. It is between McCall and the version of himself that only knows how to solve suffering by creating more suffering. And the closer he gets to the final confrontation, the clearer it becomes that this isn't really a story about becoming the strongest man in the room. It is a story about discovering that strength might mean refusing to remain that man forever. By the time McCall begins moving against the Camorra, something has changed in the way we experience his violence. The choreography can still be satisfying. The precision is still there. The familiar calculation is still there. But the emotional temperature has dropped. In the first Equalizer, watching McCall prepare for violence feels like watching a locked door finally open. You know something terrible is about to happen, but there is pleasure in seeing the machinery activate. He is finally allowed to become the person everyone underestimated. The violence feels like release. In The Equalizer 3, that same transformation feels closer to relapse. That is the crucial difference. McCall hasn't forgotten how to be Robert McCall the Weapon. He has become painfully aware of what that identity costs him. And the film makes that awareness physical. The wound from the opening doesn't simply disappear because the plot needs him to become an action hero again. He walks differently. He moves carefully. His body has a limit, and for perhaps the first time in the trilogy, that limit is visible. When he enters a confrontation, you aren't only thinking about whether the other men will survive. You are thinking about whether McCall will survive himself. That changes the meaning of his famous efficiency. The 9-second rule, which once functioned almost like a superhero origin myth, becomes something darker. McCall can still calculate how long it will take to eliminate a threat, but the calculation no longer feels like a celebration of his genius. It feels like evidence of a life he has repeated too many times. Think about what the rule actually represents. It is the ultimate expression of control. Give McCall enough information, and he can reduce violence to a sequence of decisions. 9 seconds becomes a symbol of mastery. He doesn't panic. He doesn't improvise emotionally. He measures. But what happens when mastery itself becomes exhausting? What happens when being the person who always knows exactly what to do means you have spent decades refusing to ask whether you should be doing it at all? That is the question underneath The Equalizer 3. McCall's problem isn't that he enjoys violence too much. It is almost the opposite. He has become so accustomed to violence that it has lost its ability to surprise him. That might be even more disturbing. He doesn't need anger to kill. He doesn't need hatred. He can do it calmly. And the calmness that once made him fascinating now reveals how deeply violence has become part of his identity. This is where the movie's quietness becomes important. If The Equalizer 3 were constantly shouting, the theme would be obvious. Instead, it gives McCall long stretches where nothing happens. He sits in the cafe. He walks through the streets. He watches the town. He speaks with people. He allows himself to be cared for. These scenes aren't filler. They are creating a comparison. The movie wants you to see the difference between McCall when he is killing and McCall when he is simply existing. And surprisingly, the second version of the character is more mysterious. We know exactly what happens when McCall enters a room full of criminals. We have seen it. We understand the mechanics. But what happens when he has nothing to fix? That is unfamiliar territory. For someone who has spent his life defining himself through intervention, peace can feel almost like purposelessness. This is why the question of whether McCall is a good man becomes so important. The most important scene in the movie isn't a fight. It's a conversation about whether or not a person is a good man. McCall doesn't have an answer. And Denzel Washington plays that uncertainty beautifully because he doesn't rush to resolve it. A weaker version of this story would give McCall a clean redemption. He would explain that he has always been good, that he only kills bad people, and that everything he has done was justified. The movie would reassure us that the hero's violence is morally uncomplicated. The Equalizer 3 is more interesting than that. McCall understands that intention doesn't erase consequence. He knows he has saved lives. He also knows that he has ended lives. Both things are true. That ambiguity is what makes him feel human. There is a tendency in action cinema to treat killing as morally weightless if the victims are designated villains. Once the soundtrack tells us who the bad guys are, the audience is invited to celebrate their destruction. The Equalizer franchise has always participated in that fantasy to some degree. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The movies are designed to give you the pleasure of watching an extremely capable man dismantle people who deserve punishment. But The Equalizer 3 gradually changes the emotional framing. It asks you to enjoy the spectacle while also noticing the sadness underneath it. That is not a contradiction the movie tries to solve. It is the contradiction. McCall is still terrifying. The film doesn't apologize for that. When he decides someone has crossed the line, the consequences can be brutal. But the camera increasingly treats the violence as something consequential rather than weightless. There is no sense that McCall walks away unchanged. The body remembers. The mind remembers. And perhaps most importantly, the town remembers. Altamont gives violence a social context. In the previous films, McCall can often disappear after an encounter. The people around him may know what happened, but his relationship to them remains temporary. Here, he is becoming part of a community. That means every violent act threatens the possibility of belonging. If McCall kills to protect this town, can he still become part of it? Or will the violence always keep him separate? That is the Western question again. The gunslinger can save the town, but the town may never truly be able to contain him. The difference is that McCall desperately wants it to. This is why the Camorra works better as an antagonist structure than as a collection of individual personalities. Their evil is not fascinating. It is ordinary. They represent the kind of corruption that communities experience when intimidation becomes routine. They don't need to be theatrical because the horror comes from familiarity. The local criminals aren't trying to destroy the world. They are trying to own a piece of it. They want businesses to pay them. They want people to fear them. They want ordinary life to operate according to their rules. And that makes them almost the perfect enemy for McCall. Because McCall's greatest talent has always been restoring the balance when power becomes abusive. But now he is asking himself whether restoring balance through violence simply creates another cycle. The answer isn't simple. Sometimes a violent person has to be stopped violently. The movie understands that. But it also understands that a man cannot spend his entire life being the solution to every violent problem and still expect to remain psychologically untouched. This is where McCall's age becomes more than a casting detail. He is not simply an older version of the same character. He is a character who has accumulated enough years to understand consequences. At 50, you can imagine yourself continuing indefinitely. At 70, the future becomes more concrete. There are fewer tomorrows to waste. That changes the emotional meaning of everything. McCall isn't looking for another mission. He is looking for an ending. And that is why the phrase final act feels appropriate even beyond the fact that the film was marketed as another chapter in the series. The movie carries the atmosphere of a man reaching the end of a road he has been walking for a very long time. He isn't necessarily dying. Something else is dying. The identity. The myth. The idea that Robert McCall must always be the equalizer. That is a much more interesting ending than simply killing the character. Because death would make the mythology permanent. Peace dismantles it. And peace is harder. If violence is the film's heartbeat, these quiet moments in the piazza are its soul. The cafe scenes matter because nothing about them is extraordinary. People drink coffee. They talk. They complain. They laugh. They watch the street. These are the kinds of scenes action movies normally rush through because they don't advance the plot quickly enough. Here, they are the plot. McCall is learning how ordinary people live. He is learning the rhythm of belonging. He is learning that you can contribute to a community without being its executioner. And because he is so unfamiliar with that rhythm, even small interactions become meaningful. A cup of coffee becomes more than coffee. A greeting becomes recognition. A familiar face becomes a reason to return tomorrow. That may sound sentimental, but it works because Denzel doesn't play McCall as someone suddenly transformed into a cheerful local. He remains reserved. He remains observant. There is still distance behind his eyes. Yet there is also curiosity. He is watching people not because they are potential threats, but because he wants to understand them. That is a subtle but enormous change. For most of McCall's life, observation has been preparation for violence. In Altamont, observation becomes a form of participation. He watches because he wants to know the people around him. And that is perhaps the closest thing the movie has to a spiritual transformation. McCall doesn't become innocent. He becomes present. The distinction is crucial. He cannot erase his past. He cannot undo the people he killed. He cannot pretend that decades of violence never happened. But he can decide what happens next. And that is where the idea of penance becomes more useful than redemption. Redemption can sound like a transaction. Do enough good things, and perhaps the past becomes forgiven. Penance is different. Penance means carrying the knowledge of what you have done while trying to live differently. McCall's final journey is not about proving that he was secretly a good man all along. It is about becoming a better man despite knowing exactly what he has been. That is much harder. And it makes the character's compassion more believable. When McCall protects the people of Altamont, he isn't protecting them because he thinks they will erase his past. He protects them because he has finally found people worth staying for. There is no grand ideological justification. There is attachment. That is what makes the final confrontation emotionally meaningful. He isn't fighting because he wants another victory. He is fighting because he has finally discovered something he doesn't want to lose. The action therefore becomes almost paradoxical. The closer McCall gets to peace, the more violence he has to endure. But the movie doesn't present the violence as the destination. It is the last obstacle. The Camorra believes power comes from making people afraid. McCall understands power as the ability to make that fear disappear. But his own arc asks whether he can eventually give up the power altogether. That is the real test. Can the man who has spent his life carrying the sword finally put it down? And when the final confrontation arrives, the satisfaction isn't simply that McCall is better at violence than the men standing against him. We already knew that. The satisfaction comes from understanding why he has chosen to act one final time. He is not defending his reputation. He is not protecting a secret identity. He is not trying to prove that age hasn't weakened him. He is defending a place where he can finally imagine being ordinary. That makes the violence feel less like conquest and more like sacrifice. McCall is using the very identity he wants to escape in order to protect the possibility of escaping it. It is almost tragic. And it is also deeply human. Because sometimes we don't leave our old lives cleanly. Sometimes we have to confront the final consequences of who we were before we can decide who we want to become. That is what makes The Equalizer 3 so different from a standard action sequel. The movie understands that the most difficult enemy isn't always the person standing across from you. Sometimes it is the person you have spent years becoming. And McCall's greatest victory is not proving that he can still kill. It is discovering that he doesn't have to keep doing it. The tactical fantasy remains intact. But the fantasy has finally grown old. The perfect killer is still perfect enough. The question is no longer whether he can finish the job. The question is whether he can finally finish the life that created him. And perhaps that is why the movie feels so strangely melancholic even when it is delivering the action audiences came to see. We are watching a man perform the final version of a skill he no longer wants to define him. The knife is still sharp. The hand holding it is still steady. But for the first time, McCall is looking at the blade and wondering what it would mean to put it away. And that is what makes the final confrontation feel different from everything that came before it. McCall isn't walking toward another victory. He is walking toward a decision. The Camorra has made Altamont unsafe, and McCall has finally decided that he cannot simply watch the town he has come to love be consumed by fear. But notice what the movie does not do. It doesn't turn McCall into a triumphant superhero. It doesn't suddenly make him young again. It doesn't erase the pain in his body. It doesn't pretend that violence has stopped costing him something. Instead, it allows his physical limitations to remain part of the moment. That matters because the climax isn't really about whether McCall can defeat these men. Of course he can. The entire trilogy has trained us to believe that. The suspense comes from what defeating them means. For the first time, McCall has something to return to. That changes everything. Earlier in the franchise, McCall's missions could feel almost self-contained. He would enter a situation, identify the threat, destroy it, and move on. Even when the emotional stakes were personal, there was still a sense that McCall existed outside the communities he protected. He was a temporary force of correction. Altamont makes that impossible. The people here know him. They feed him. They speak to him. They care whether he is alive. And that means McCall is no longer fighting for an abstract concept of justice. He is fighting for specific people whose lives have become connected to his own. That is the emotional foundation of the final act. McCall has spent years believing that isolation was the price of protecting others. Now the film suggests that isolation may have been the thing preventing him from truly understanding what he was protecting. You can save strangers. It is harder to belong to the people you save. Because belonging creates vulnerability. Once you care about a place, you can lose it. Once you care about people, they can hurt you. Once you allow yourself to be known, you can no longer disappear without leaving something behind. McCall has avoided all of that for decades. Altamont makes him choose it. And this is where the Western comparison becomes especially powerful. The classic gunslinger arrives from nowhere, restores order, and eventually rides away. He is too dangerous for the peaceful society he helped create. His reward is often separation. McCall's fantasy is different. He wants to stay. That small difference transforms the entire ending. He isn't searching for another road. He is searching for a home. That makes the final violence feel almost like the last requirement of an old identity. He has to become the equalizer one more time because the world around him still needs that version of him. But the movie has spent enough time establishing that this cannot be his permanent state. The final battle therefore becomes a negotiation between two identities. The man he has been, and the man he might become. When McCall moves through the enemy's territory, the old mechanics return. Observation, timing, positioning, improvisation. He studies the environment and turns it against the people who believe they control it. This is the McCall method in its purest form. But now there is something almost elegiac about it. You are watching a master perform a skill at the end of his career. There is beauty in the precision, but there is also sadness. Because you understand that this may be the last time. And the movie doesn't need to say that directly. Denzel's physicality says it for him. Every movement feels considered. Every confrontation has weight. There is no youthful arrogance. No sense that McCall believes he is invulnerable. He knows exactly what he is risking. That awareness makes him more compelling, not less. The action becomes an expression of character rather than spectacle. This is something Antoine Fuqua has understood throughout the franchise. Violence in these movies works best when it tells us something about McCall. His efficiency reveals his discipline. His improvisation reveals his intelligence. His refusal to panic reveals his emotional control. But in the third film, the same traits reveal something else. The longer he remains inside this identity, the more exhausted he becomes. The final confrontation therefore doesn't erase the central theme of penance. It completes it. McCall is not earning forgiveness by killing the villains. He is creating the conditions under which he might finally stop killing. That distinction is everything. The movie could have ended with McCall standing over a pile of bodies, looking satisfied, ready for another mission. That would have been the easy ending. It would have preserved the action fantasy exactly as it was. Instead, the film moves towards something quieter. McCall survives. The town survives. The people survive. And McCall is left with the possibility of a life that doesn't require him to disappear. That is the real victory. Not the bodies. Not the tactics. Not the final opponent. The possibility of tomorrow. For an action hero, that is an unusual form of triumph. Most action franchises reward their protagonists by making them more powerful. The Equalizer 3 rewards McCall by making him less necessary. Think about that. The entire mythology of Robert McCall is based on the idea that the world needs him because other people cannot solve certain problems. But his emotional journey reaches its conclusion when he finds a place where he doesn't have to be indispensable. He doesn't need to be the smartest person in the room. He doesn't need to be the most dangerous person in the room. He doesn't need to be feared. He can simply be present. That is why the final reconciliation isn't really between McCall and the Camorra. It is between McCall and himself. He has spent years dividing his identity into two parts. The ordinary man he wishes he could be, and the violent man he knows he is capable of becoming. The trilogy has constantly forced those identities together. By the end, McCall doesn't erase one of them. He accepts both. He knows what he has done. He knows what he can do. And he finally understands that knowing how to kill doesn't mean he has to spend every remaining day proving it. That is a mature form of redemption. It doesn't require pretending the past never happened. It requires choosing what happens next. And perhaps this is where Denzel Washington's performance becomes most affecting. McCall's happiness is never exaggerated. There is no transformation into a completely different person. He doesn't suddenly become talkative or playful. He remains quiet. But the quiet means something different now. At the beginning of the film, his silence feels like isolation. At the end, it feels like peace. That is a remarkable performance choice. The same face. The same voice. The same posture. A different emotional meaning. That is the advantage of an actor who trusts stillness. Denzel doesn't need to tell us that McCall has changed because the environment around him tells us. He is no longer standing alone in a dark room. He is sitting among people. He is being recognized. He is allowed to exist without explaining himself. The man who spent his life watching from the edge of society has finally found a place inside it. And there is something almost spiritual about that. McCall has always been described through religious imagery. He is an angel of vengeance, a punisher, a man who appears when people have lost hope. But angels aren't supposed to stay. They appear, intervene, and disappear. McCall's final evolution is therefore a rejection of that mythology. He doesn't want to be an angel anymore. He wants to be a man. A flawed man. An aging man. A man carrying things he cannot undo. But a man who can still choose. That choice is what makes the ending cathartic. The film's emotional journey begins with the pleasure of a perfect kill and ends with the possibility of a life without one. That is a radical transformation for a franchise built around violence. And it is why the third movie works best when viewed less as a conventional sequel and more as a spiritual epilogue. The plot is simple. The emotional architecture is not. McCall begins the movie wounded because the body is finally demanding payment. He enters Altamont because fate places him there. He stays because the town gives him something he didn't realize he wanted. He fights because that new home is threatened. And he ends by realizing that the thing worth protecting was never simply the town. It was the possibility of becoming someone who could belong there. That is the difference between justice and peace. Justice asks who deserves punishment. Peace asks what kind of life can exist after the punishment ends. McCall has spent decades answering the first question. The Equalizer 3 finally lets him consider the second. And that is why the ending feels so much more emotional than the body count would suggest. The violence is not the destination. It is the final echo of a life that is ending. The sword is still there. But McCall no longer needs to worship it. He can put it down. And perhaps that is the most compassionate thing the character could ever do for himself. This wasn't just the end of a sequel trilogy. It was the final period on a specific type of cinematic hero we haven't seen since the days of the Western. The lone man. The stranger. The outsider who arrives when institutions fail. The person capable of extraordinary violence but increasingly uncomfortable with the world that requires it. And that brings us to the larger legacy of Robert McCall, because his ending means more when we understand the kind of action hero he represents. The Equalizer trilogy arrived during a decade obsessed with aging warriors. Hollywood spent the 2010s repeatedly asking what happens when men built for violence become too old to keep doing it the way they once did. The answer was rarely simple. Sometimes it was tragic. Sometimes it was sentimental. Sometimes it was brutally honest. But the question kept returning. What does an action hero become when the body that created the myth begins to fail? Logan gave us one answer. Rambo. Last Blood gave us another. And The Equalizer 3 offers something quieter. Not death. Not revenge. Retirement. That may sound less dramatic. But emotionally, it is more difficult. Because death ends the story. Retirement forces the character to live with it. McCall doesn't get to erase his past. He has to wake up tomorrow knowing who he was. And that is why his final act feels less like a victory lap than an act of acceptance. The myth of the vigilante has always depended on the idea that one exceptional person can correct a broken world through force. The Equalizer 3 doesn't completely reject that fantasy. It simply asks what happens when the vigilante finally realizes that a broken world cannot be repaired one body at a time. That realization doesn't make McCall useless. It makes him human. And perhaps that is the most fitting place for Denzel Washington to leave him. Not as an invincible machine. Not as a superhero. Not even as a legendary killer. But as a tired man who finally understands that mercy can mean more than sparing someone else's life. Sometimes mercy means allowing yourself to stop fighting. And that is the final act of Robert McCall. Not revenge. Not domination. Mercy. This wasn't just the end of a sequel trilogy, it was the final period on a specific type of cinematic hero we haven't seen since the days of the Western. The lone man. The stranger. The outsider who arrives when institutions fail. The person capable of extraordinary violence but increasingly uncomfortable with the world that requires it. And when you place Robert McCall beside the aging heroes of the 2010s, his journey becomes part of a much larger cinematic conversation. The decade gave us a remarkable number of older action protagonists. Logan. Rambo. Ethan Hunt continuing far beyond the age when most heroes would have retired. John Wick turning grief into an endless cycle of violence. Even characters outside traditional action cinema were increasingly defined by the question of what happens when a person's greatest skill becomes inseparable from their trauma. But McCall is different. He isn't simply trying to survive old age. He is trying to survive his own mythology. That distinction is what makes The Equalizer 3 such an interesting closing chapter. When Logan came out in 2017, its emotional power came partly from watching a nearly broken man confront the consequences of a life built around violence. Logan's body was failing. His healing ability was disappearing. The character who once seemed almost indestructible was finally forced to acknowledge mortality. Rambo, Last Blood approached the same idea through revenge. Its protagonist was older, traumatized, and still capable of extraordinary violence, but the world around him had changed. His physical strength remained, yet the meaning of that strength had become darker. The Equalizer 3 takes another route. McCall's body is failing, but his story isn't fundamentally about dying. It's about stopping. That sounds less dramatic, but it may actually be more mature. Because when an action hero dies, the mythology can remain untouched. The audience can remember him exactly as he was. Every impossible fight becomes part of the legend. Every victory remains perfect. Retirement is different. Retirement means admitting that the legend has an expiration date. It means saying, I can still do this, but I don't want to. And for McCall, that is almost unimaginable. His identity has been built around competence. He knows how to read people. He knows how to read spaces. He knows how to calculate risk. He knows how to hurt people efficiently. He knows how to survive. But none of those skills tell him how to live. That is the central tragedy of the vigilante archetype. The vigilante is useful because society has failed. But if society succeeds, what happens to the vigilante? What happens when the world no longer needs the person who exists to correct its failures? The answer is usually loneliness. The Western understood this instinctively. The gunslinger is useful in the wilderness because the wilderness is violent. But civilization eventually arrives, and civilization has no comfortable place for a man who solves problems with a gun. He can protect the town. He can defeat the villain. But once the streets are safe, Everyone begins asking the same question. What do we do with him now? McCall's answer is different because he doesn't want to ride away. He wants to stay. That is the emotional breakthrough. He wants the coffee shop. He wants the familiar faces. He wants the streets. He wants the ordinary rhythm of a place where people know him. The irony is that the thing he spent his life protecting was exactly the thing he never allowed himself to possess. Community. The vigilante believes he can love humanity from a distance. McCall learns that distance is not the same thing as love. You can protect strangers, but eventually you have to let people become important to you. That creates risk. It creates fear. It creates the possibility of loss. But it also creates meaning. And that is why the final scenes matter so much. The cup of tea, the coffee, the quiet street, the familiar faces. These details may seem almost trivial compared with the film's violence, but they represent the life McCall could never have imagined at the beginning of the trilogy. The first film gives him a routine because routine helps him control his trauma. The third film gives him a community because community helps him move beyond it. That is a subtle but important distinction. At the beginning, McCall's routines are solitary. He reads alone. He eats alone. He travels alone. He observes people without becoming part of their lives. By the end, the ordinary rituals of daily life are shared. He isn't simply watching anymore. He is participating. And participation requires vulnerability. This is where the title The Last Cup of Tea becomes more than a poetic image. Tea has always carried a strange significance in the mythology of McCall. It represents patience, ritual, control, a small moment of stillness before violence. He drinks while the world around him moves. In the first movie, that ritual feels like preparation. By the end, it feels like acceptance. The cup is no longer something he uses to organize his solitude. It becomes something he can share with a world he has finally allowed himself to enter. That is why the quiet ending works. There is no need for another massive threat. There is no need for one more international conspiracy. There is no need for McCall to prove anything. The story has already answered the question. He can stop. And that is where the franchise's core fantasy finally turns inside out. The first Equalizer asks us to imagine what it would feel like if an ordinary-looking man possessed extraordinary power. The third asks us to imagine what it would feel like if that man finally decided he didn't need to use it. The first fantasy is exhilarating. The second is emotional. Both are satisfying. But they satisfy different needs. That is why fans who love the original movies for the tactical spectacle don't need to feel betrayed by the slower tone of the third. Your nostalgia makes sense. The fights are part of what made McCall special. The precision is part of the character. The 9-second rule is part of the mythology. The objects becoming weapons are part of the fun. None of that disappears. Instead, the third film asks you to look at those elements from a different angle. What once looked like power now looks like history. What once looked like confidence now sometimes looks like exhaustion. What once felt like revenge now feels like penance. That doesn't make the earlier movies meaningless. It gives them context. The trilogy becomes a progression. The first film is about rediscovering the weapon. The second is about using the weapon for others. The third is about learning when to put it down. That structure isn't perfect, and the film certainly has weaknesses. Some of the supporting characters are underdeveloped. The villains aren't especially memorable compared with some of the antagonists from the first two movies. The pacing can feel unusually slow if you're expecting another escalation-driven action sequel. And the plot itself is straightforward enough that viewers looking for intricate storytelling may find it thin. Those criticisms are fair. The Equalizer 3 isn't secretly a masterpiece because it moves slowly. It has limitations. But those limitations are also connected to its greatest strength. The film knows what it wants to be. It isn't trying to compete with the biggest action spectacles of its era. It isn't trying to become John Wick. It isn't trying to create a giant mythology. It is trying to give Robert McCall somewhere to end. And sometimes the most satisfying conclusion isn't the biggest one. It's the one that feels inevitable. McCall's journey toward peace has been present since the beginning. He has always been searching for a way to balance his violent past with his desire to do good. He has always carried guilt. He has always been drawn toward people who need protection. He has always wanted some form of redemption. But redemption requires a destination. Altamont gives him one. That is why the setting matters so much to the ending. It isn't just where the final villains happen to operate. It is where McCall discovers that his life can have a second vocabulary. Before Altamont, his language is violence. After Altamont, he has words like community, friendship, care, belonging, patience. Those things sound ordinary. For McCall, they are revolutionary. And perhaps that is why Denzel Washington's final performance as the character feels so warm despite all the brutality surrounding it. He doesn't play McCall as a man who has finally solved himself. He plays him as a man who has finally stopped demanding that he be solved. The past will remain. The scars will remain. The memories will remain. But the future doesn't have to repeat them. That is enough. And when you look back at the trilogy from that perspective, the violence takes on a completely different meaning. In the first film, the violence feels like awakening. McCall rediscovers the part of himself he tried to bury. In the second, it becomes responsibility. He uses that ability because he believes he can make the world safer. In the third, it becomes burden. He realizes that the same ability that allows him to protect others also keeps him trapped inside the identity of the killer. That is the progression. Power. Purpose. Penance. And finally, peace. It is a surprisingly spiritual arc for a franchise that contains this much bloodshed. But perhaps that is why the ending resonates. The movie isn't arguing that violence is never necessary. It isn't arguing that McCall was wrong to intervene. It isn't asking us to condemn the character for the fantasy that made him entertaining. It is asking us to understand that even justified violence can leave a person changed. That is a mature idea. And it becomes even more meaningful when you consider the age of the actor carrying it. Denzel Washington isn't pretending that time hasn't passed. He is letting time become part of the performance. The character is older because the actor is older. The body is slower because the actor's physical presence carries decades of history. The silences are longer because the movie understands that experience doesn't always need dialogue. This is where the Fuqua-Washington collaboration reaches its natural endpoint. They began by creating an action character defined by control. They end by creating a character defined by restraint. And restraint is arguably the harder performance. Anyone can play anger. Anyone can play revenge. Anyone can play a man shouting that he will destroy the people who hurt him. It takes more confidence to play a man who simply decides he doesn't want to live that way anymore. That is the emotional achievement of The Equalizer 3. Not that McCall kills better. That he chooses better. And maybe that is the most appropriate legacy for this character. Robert McCall is not the fastest action hero. He isn't the strongest. He isn't the most technologically advanced. He doesn't have a superhero costume or a secret laboratory. His greatest weapon has always been attention. He notices. He waits. He decides. And in the end, that same attention turns inward. He finally notices himself. He notices the exhaustion. He notices the loneliness. He notices the cost. He notices the possibility of something else. That is why the final cup matters. Because the greatest fantasy in the entire Equalizer trilogy was never really that one man could kill 10 men in 9 seconds. It was that a man who had spent his entire life believing he was destined for violence could discover another destiny. A quieter one. A smaller one. A human one. And if you grew up watching action movies where heroes were rewarded for being tougher, faster, and more violent, there is something deeply satisfying about seeing a character reach the end of his story and realize that the greatest form of strength is not destruction,